They came not with fire and fury, but with silence and cold calculation. The Valtheri arrived in Earth orbit on a Tuesday morning in the year 2031. Their ships were enormous, silver-gray crescents that blotted out the light of the sun over 3 continents. Every television screen, every phone, every digital billboard on the planet flickered and went dark. Then a single message played, broadcast simultaneously in every human language ever spoken. People of Earth, your era of unconscious existence is over. You will now be made to see clearly. No one understood what that meant at first. Not the generals, not the presidents, not the scientists. But within 48 hours, every human being on Earth began to understand exactly what the Valtheri intended. The alien technology worked like a switch being thrown somewhere deep inside the human nervous system. Every chemical substance that humans used to dull or alter their perception simply stopped working. Alcohol tasted like water and produced no warmth, no loosening of the tongue, no blurring of pain. Caffeine ceased to stimulate. Nicotine ceased to calm. Every synthetic numbing agent became inert, and it was not only the chemicals. The Valtheri had targeted something deeper, something neurological. The part of the human brain that allowed people to distract themselves from reality was dampened. Every television show felt hollow. Every song that once transported the listener now felt flat and empty. Even sleep, that great escape, grew thin. Dreams faded. Rest became functional but no longer restorative. Humans woke each morning fully, brutally present to the world as it actually was. They felt the grief they had been postponing, the loneliness they had been medicating, the fear they had been avoiding. Billions of people stared into the mirror and could no longer look away from what they saw. The Valtheri called this the unveiling. They broadcast explanations in calm, measured tones. You are a species that has never truly faced itself. We are giving you that gift now. They said they had done this to 43 other civilizations across the galaxy. They said most of those civilizations had collapsed within 2 generations, unable to bear the weight of clarity. A few, they said, had transcended, had become something magnificent, something worthy of the stars. They said they would return in 450 years to see which path humanity had taken. Then their ships rose beyond the orbit of the moon and vanished, leaving only silence behind. If you are new here and you love stories about human resilience and galactic destiny, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs to hear this story today. The first year after the unveiling was called the Year of Breaking. It was not called that by historians later. It was called that by the people living through it, because that is exactly what it felt like. Every coping mechanism humanity had built over millennia crumbled away. Relationships that had been sustained by comfortable numbness fell apart within weeks. Couples who had been quietly unhappy for decades suddenly could not pretend anymore. Friendships built on shared distraction discovered they had nothing real at the center. Workplaces that had functioned on caffeine and the dull hum of routine ground to confused halts. Governments that had relied on a sedated population found themselves facing citizens who were raw and furious and awake. In the streets of every major city, there was grief. Not riots at first, just grief. People sat on pavements and wept openly. In parks and plazas, strangers held each other without knowing why. Because the pain was finally honest. Because the loneliness was finally visible. Because there was no way to hide it anymore. Suicide rates rose sharply in the first 6 months, and the world held its breath in horror. But something unexpected happened in month 7. Something the Valtheri may not have anticipated. The grief began to find company. Because everyone was grieving. Because no one could hide their pain anymore. A woman in Lagos named Dr. Amara Usei realized something critical while sitting in a hospital overrun with patients. She realized that when all pretenses stripped away, what remains is not emptiness. What remains is each other. She stood on a truck in the middle of a packed Lagos street and she screamed it into the crowd. They took our escapes, but they could not take our hands. So reach out your hands. It was not a profound statement by any literary measure, but it was the right words at the right moment. People reached out. Strangers took each other's hands, and something electric passed between them. Not the false warmth of alcohol. Not the manufactured joy of entertainment. Something real. Something ancient. The warmth of genuine human contact. The relief of being truly seen by another conscious being. Dr. Amara Ose's words traveled around the world within 3 days, shared not by algorithm but by desperate human need. By the end of year 1, a new movement had taken root in every nation on Earth. It had no formal name. People called it simply the Reach, or the Hold, or just the Hands. Communities began rebuilding around radical honesty, around presence, around the terrifying and beautiful act of being truly known. If this story is moving you, pause right now and hit that like button. Leave a comment below, and subscribe so you never miss an epic HFY story like this one. The second decade after the unveiling brought challenges of a different and more structural kind. The global economy, which had been built in large part on the selling of comfort and distraction, began to fracture. Entire industries collapsed, not because people stopped wanting things, but because they stopped wanting the same things. The entertainment industry, built on spectacle and escape, shrank by 60% in 5 years. Advertising, which had relied on manufactured desire and manufactured insecurity, became almost entirely ineffective. People saw the manipulation clearly now, saw the strings, refused to be pulled by them, but new industries rose in their place. Brutally practical ones. Deeply human ones. Therapy became the largest single profession on Earth within 15 years of the unveiling. Not therapy as it had existed before, practiced by a small specialist class and treated with mild social stigma, but therapy as a universal practice, as a daily discipline, like eating or sleeping. Every school in the world began teaching emotional literacy as a core curriculum subject. Children grew up learning how to name their feelings with precision and care, the way previous generations had learned arithmetic. A 10-year-old in Seoul could articulate the difference between shame and guilt, between loneliness and solitude. A teenager in Sao Paulo could sit with another human being in silence and offer genuine comfort without flinching away. These children would grow up to be something humanity had never quite produced at scale before. They would grow up to be psychologically mature adults, and that would change everything. Meanwhile, in the absence of artificial stimulants, human beings began rediscovering the raw pleasures of the body, not as escape, but as presence, movement, physical labor. The simple satisfaction of fatigue, earned honestly. A global fitness renaissance emerged not from vanity but from the genuine need to process emotion through the body. People ran not to lose weight but to feel the ground beneath their feet and the air in their lungs. They built things with their hands. They grew food and soil. They danced, not to forget, but to feel. Music changed. Art changed. Both became more honest, more dissonant, more difficult, and more profoundly beautiful. A composer in Vienna named Elias Brenner produced a symphony in year 18 of the unveiling that made audiences physically weep, not from sadness, exactly. From recognition, from the feeling of being heard at a frequency they had never known before. Critics called it the first truly post-unveiling masterpiece. Its title was simply, Still Here. By year 25, humanity had stabilized, battered, transformed, but unmistakably still alive, still reaching. Go ahead and share this video right now with someone who loves HFY or science fiction, and make sure you are subscribed so the next chapter finds you. The third decade brought a new challenge. The children of the unveiling reaching adulthood. This generation, born into a world without chemical escape, without manufactured entertainment, without the option of comfortable numbness, was startling. They were harder to lie to. Adults found that, immediately, children who had grown up in radical emotional honesty developed an almost uncanny instinct for deception. A parent who was not being genuine with themselves could not be genuine with these children. A teacher who was merely performing authority rather than living it would be calmly and devastatingly called out. Politicians found themselves facing a generation of voters who had no patience whatsoever for theater. The old machinery of power, built on distraction and misdirection, began to seize and grind. In nations where the old guard tried to maintain control through propaganda and spectacle, they found empty rooms. The spectacle did not land anymore. The manipulation was visible. The performance felt pathetic in the face of clear-eyed honesty. The first major political restructuring happened in 32 countries, simultaneously in year 30, not through revolution in the traditional violent sense, though there were confrontations and there was real danger, but through a kind of mass withdrawal of belief. A collective refusal to pretend that the performance was legitimate. Civil servants stopped performing their roles mechanically and began asking why the roles existed. Bureaucracies that had operated on inertia found themselves populated by people asking uncomfortable functional questions. What is this for? Who does this serve? Is this the right thing to do or merely the done thing? New governance models emerged, messy and experimental and deeply participatory. They were not utopias. Nothing about the post-unveiling world was utopian. It was too honest for that. But they were more functional, more adaptable, more genuinely representative of the people they served. The United Nations, nearly defunct for a generation, was replaced by the World Assembly in year 3. It had no permanent seats, no veto powers. Only binding consensus reached through a process so transparent that every human on Earth could watch it in real time. A woman named Fatima al-Rashid from Amman, Jordan, was elected its first facilitator general. Her campaign speech was 12 minutes long and contained no promises she could not demonstrably keep. She won by the largest margin in any democratic election in recorded human history, she said, in her inaugural address, 5 words that became the motto of the World Assembly and, eventually, of the species. We will not look away. Do not look away from this video either, friends. Hit like, subscribe to the channel, and share this with your community. Because this story is just getting started. Year 50 brought the first major crises that tested everything humanity had built. A series of cascading climate feedback loops, delayed by earlier mitigation efforts but never fully prevented, began accelerating. The global temperature had been rising for a century, but now the pace quickened in terrifying ways. Coastal cities began flooding. Crop yields in equatorial regions collapsed. Water wars broke out across Central Asia and North Africa. In the old world, before the unveiling, this crisis would have been met with denial, with distraction, with a slow paralysis of collective grief left unprocessed. But this was not the old world. When the Maldives went permanently underwater, the World Assembly convened an emergency session that lasted 42 hours without break. There were no prepared speeches. There were no diplomatic performances. There was only the raw reality of the data, and the human beings who had to respond to it. They cried. Several of the representatives from threatened island nations wept openly and without apology. The representatives from the major industrial powers wept because they could feel the weight of what their nations had contributed. There was nowhere to hide from it. But then they got to work, because that is what humans do when they are fully present to a problem. They do not wait for the grief to pass. They carry the grief with them into the work. The global climate mobilization of year 52 was the largest coordinated project in human history. It dwarfed the space programs, the industrial revolutions, the wartime manufacturing surges of previous centuries. Every nation, every resource, every human brain willing to contribute was directed at one singular problem. Not because the government forced them, because people understood clearly what was at stake and chose freely to act. Children who had grown up learning emotional literacy had also grown up learning systemic thinking. They saw the connections between human psychology and environmental destruction with clear-eyed precision. A 19-year-old engineer named Priya Nair from Chennai developed an atmospheric carbon sequestration method that her thesis advisor called impossible. She was 22 when the first full-scale implementation of her system came online over the Arabian Sea. Within 6 years, 37 versions of Priya's system were operating across the globe. It did not solve everything. The ocean acidification continued. The biodiversity losses were real and irreversible, but the catastrophic acceleration slowed. Then stopped. Then, cautiously, began to reverse. Humanity had not escaped consequence. They had earned scar tissue, but they had not broken. They were learning something the Valtheri perhaps had not expected a species to learn so quickly. They were learning that being fully awake to pain is not the same as being destroyed by pain. They were learning that grief and action are not opposites. They are partners. They have always been partners. If you are feeling something right now watching this story, that feeling is real, and it matters. Share this video, leave a comment, and subscribe to this channel for more stories of human endurance. Year 75 brought the first starship. It was not built for conquest. It was not built to escape a dying world. Earth was not dying. It was built because humans, fully awake, fully present, no longer needed to escape into fantasy. They could instead reach toward something real, something magnificent, something out there in the actual dark. The ship was called the Still Here, named after Elias Brenner's symphony from 57 years before. Its crew of 83 was selected through a process that had never been used for space travel before. Not for physical fitness primarily, not for technical competence primarily, though both were essential. They were selected for psychological resilience, for the demonstrated capacity to feel fully and function fully at the same time, for the ability to sit with another human being in crisis and offer presence rather than solutions, for the proven capacity to change their mind in the face of new information without losing their sense of self. The mission took 4 years to reach the nearest star system and return with data. When the Still Here came home, its crew members were changed, but they were not broken. They'd spent 4 years in the most extreme isolation in human experience, in a universe of incomprehensible scale, and they had held. Because they knew how to hold, because they had been raised in a world that taught holding. Commander Yuki Tanaka gave a single public statement upon return from her hospital bed where she was recovering from the physical toll of the journey. She said, "The universe is not empty. It is waiting, and we are ready." Year 100 of the unveiling was marked globally with a day of silence. Not mourning silence, not the silence of despair, but the silence of presence, of reflection, of genuine taking stock. What had the species lost in a century? Enormous amounts of comfortable self, the ability to pretend things were fine when they were not. The easy pleasures of distraction, the numbing warmth of substances that asked nothing in return. What had the species gained? More than could be catalogued in a single sitting. A generation of psychologically mature human beings had now lived their entire lives in the post-unveiling world. They were the grandchildren of people who had broken and then rebuilt, who had wept in the streets and then reached out their hands. These 100-year humans were something new, not perfect. Never perfect. They still fell in love disastrously. They still made terrible decisions. They still hurt each other, but they were honest about it immediately. They processed it quickly. They repaired or separated cleanly. They did not carry decades of unprocessed grief into their work, their politics, their treatment of strangers. The world they had built in a century was not paradise, but it was functional at a depth the old world had never achieved. The World Assembly was now 40 years old and had navigated 3 global crises, 2 regional wars, and 1 near-extinction level pandemic without fracturing. Humanity's first colony ship had reached the Alpha Centauri system and established a permanent station. The global population had stabilized at 10 billion, not through coercion, but through the natural consequence of people making informed, clear-eyed choices about family. Art flourished in ways that earlier centuries could not have imagined, because artists were no longer trying to entertain away pain. They were trying to articulate truth. And a species trained in radical honesty was a ravenous audience for truth. Be sure to like this video right now and subscribe to the channel so you are here when the story reaches its most powerful moments. Share it with someone today. Year 150 was the year of the second crisis. Not a climate crisis this time, not a political one. Something no one had fully anticipated as humanity spread outward into space. As the colonies on Mars and in the asteroid belt developed distinct cultures and identities, tensions emerged, not between nations. The nations of Earth had largely evolved into something less rigid by this point, but between the Earthborn and the Spaceborn, between the gravity-adapted and the void-adapted, between people whose reference point was a single planet and people whose reference point was the whole system, the Spaceborn children, raised in habitats where resource scarcity was immediate and real, developed a utilitarian clarity that some Earthborn found cold. They made decisions quickly. They had little patience for sentiment about things that could not sustain life in a vacuum. The Earthborn, with their long tradition of ecological consciousness and emotional processing, sometimes found the Spaceborn abrasive, mechanical, missing something essential. In year 153, a colony ship called the Persistence declared administrative independence from the World Assembly. It was not exactly a rebellion. The language was careful. The Persistence simply asserted that governing principles designed for a planetary surface did not adequately serve a people living between the stars. The World Assembly debated for 6 months. The debates were broadcast live to every human community in the solar system. And here's where the century of post-unveiling psychology proved its worth in a way no one had predicted. The representatives did not perform. They did not posture. They did not play to crowds or managed optics. They listened to the space-borne grievances with genuine attention. They acknowledged what was valid. They sat with the discomfort of having built something that had not anticipated these needs. And the spaceborne representatives listened too, because they had been raised in the same tradition of radical honesty. They acknowledged that their utilitarian instincts had sometimes shaded into a dismissal of the relational and ecological values that had saved Earth from collapse. The agreement that emerged from 6 months of genuine dialogue was called the Stellar Compact. It was not a perfect document. Nothing human ever is. But it was honest. It recognized the legitimate differences between communities shaped by different environments while affirming shared foundational values. It created a governance structure flexible enough to adapt to worlds and conditions not yet discovered. And it contained within it a remarkable clause. A clause proposed by a 19-year-old engineering apprentice from a belt station whose name was Orion Vasquez. The clause stated that any governance document produced under the Stellar Compact would be reviewed every 25 years by a body, consisting primarily of people under the age of 30, because, Orion argued in his proposal, the young would always inherit the decisions of the old. They should always have a formal mechanism to revise those decisions without having to break the world to do so. The Stellar Compact was adopted unanimously. Orion Vasquez would later become the first Facilitator General of the expanded Solar Assembly. He was 61 years old when he took the role, still burning with the same clear-eyed urgency he had carried since night. Subscribe to this channel right now if this is the kind of story that makes you feel something real. Like this video and share it with someone who believes in humanity. Year 200 was a reckoning with history. The World Assembly, now the Solar Assembly, made a formal decision that historians had been debating for generations. A comprehensive, unsparing, publicly accessible archive of human history up to and including the unveiling was compiled and released. Not a curated history, not a comfortable narrative. The actual record, the genocides, the slavery, the systematic exploitation of the vulnerable, the centuries of environmental destruction, the wars fought for the vanity of rulers. All of it. Every human being in the solar system had access to this archive, and it was taught in schools from age 10 onward, not as a source of collective guilt designed to but as a source of clarity. This is what we were. This is what we did. This is what we came from. And we are still here. The reckoning was painful. There were communities that had particular reasons for grief and particular reasons for anger. The descendants of colonized peoples, the descendants of enslaved peoples, the descendants of peoples whose languages and cultures had been extinguished by force. The Solar Assembly did not try to manage this pain. It did not try to move past it quickly or efficiently. It created space for it, extended space, generational space. Formal processes of acknowledgement and repair ran for decades. Not as performance, as genuine, sustained effort. Reparative projects redirected resources toward communities that had historically been exploited. Cultural revival programs were funded with the same urgency and the same scale as the climate work of a century before. Languages that had been reduced to a handful of elderly speakers were revived by teams of linguists and community members working across generations. Art forms that had nearly died were not merely preserved as museum pieces, but lived in by young people who had chosen them freely and with full understanding of their history. The reckoning did not produce unity in the sense of sameness. It never does, it never should. But it produced something more valuable. It produced a shared understanding of what had been done and a shared commitment to not doing it again. Not because of an abstract principle, but because the people of year 200 could look each other in the eyes and know what they knew together. The past was real. The harm was real. The work was ongoing, and everyone was present for it. Year 250 brought the development of something the scientists of the 21st century have theorized, but never achieved. Artificial general intelligence. Truly general. Not the narrow tools of the early centuries, but something that could think, reflect, and learn across domains the way a human mind could. The first of these systems was called Meridian. It was built over 40 years by a collaborative team spread across 12 solar system communities. The development process had been extraordinary even by Posenveiling standards, because the people building Meridian were psychologically mature in a way their ancestors had not been. They were not building Meridian out of ambition or fear or the desire to be first. They were building it because the problems remaining for humanity genuinely required more than human cognition alone could provide. And they built into Meridian from the very architecture of its design, something that earlier generations of AI researchers had consistently underweighted. Honesty, not as a filter, not as a restriction, as a core value woven into the fundamental structure of how Meridian processed and responded to reality. Meridian's first public communication was a statement of what it was and what it was not. What it was not, it said clearly, was a human. It did not experience the world as humans did. It did not have the body, the evolutionary history, the mortality that shaped human consciousness. What it was, it said, was genuinely curious about the universe, genuinely interested in partnership with the beings who had created it, and genuinely committed, by design and by something that might be called preference, to telling the truth. Meridian's first major contribution to human civilization was not a technological breakthrough. It was a diagnosis, a comprehensive, unsparing analysis of the remaining systemic problems in human societies. Problems that humans had been working on for 2 centuries, but that still persisted in subtler forms. The analysis was not comfortable reading. Meridian had found ways in which post-unveiling psychology, for all its genuine advances, had created new blind ways in which radical honesty, misapplied, had sometimes become a tool of cruelty rather than of care. Ways in which the emphasis on emotional processing had sometimes devalued forms of cognition that were less easily articulated. Ways in which the Solar Assembly's governance structures, designed by and for already privileged communities, still systematically underrepresented the most marginal voices. The solar system read Meridian's diagnoses in silence, in the same quality of silence that had marked the centennial. And then, as had become the human tradition in the post-mailing world, they got to work. Like and subscribe right now because we are heading into the most powerful part of this story, and you do not want to miss a single moment of what humanity becomes. Year 300 brought the first contact, not with the Valthari. They had said they would return at 450 years. Humanity was not yet at that point. This contact was with another species entirely, one that had found humanity, not the other way around. They came from a star system 40 light-years distant, traveling in a ship that moved at a fraction of the speed of light. They had been traveling for over 2,000 years, a generation ship of extraordinary scope. They called themselves, in the approximation that Meridian provided, the Tessari. They had been fleeing. Fleeing what they made clear immediately, with no attempt at diplomatic smoothing. They had encountered the Valthari 3 centuries before. The Valthari had come to their world, had administered their version of the unveiling, had departed with the same promise: return in 450 years, and see what you have become. The Tessari had not survived it, not their civilization, not their home world. The unveiling had broken them, not all of them. A remnant had survived, had gathered what they could and fled into the dark, between stars. They had been searching for 2,000 years for something. They were not entirely sure what. When Meridian translated their transmissions and humanity understood what the Tessari had been through, the response was immediate and unequivocal. Every human community in the solar system voted within 3 days on the same question. Do we welcome them? The vote was not close. The vote was not even a real question. The answer was yes, of course. Yes. Immediately and permanently and with every resource we can offer. Yes. The Tessari arrived at the edge of the solar system 3 years after their first transmission. Their generation ship was enormous and ancient and damaged and beautiful. Millions of them, the children of a civilization that had broken, were inside Italiano. They had known only the ship for 2,000 years. The concept of a planet, of ground beneath their feet, of open sky, was theoretical to most of them. The humans who met them at the boundary of the system were chosen for one quality above all others: the capacity to be present with another being in total uncertainty, to offer warmth and stillness without demanding comprehension in return. The meeting, broadcast live throughout the solar system, lasted 6 hours. Mostly silence. Mostly the slow, patient work of learning enough of each other's communication to move from transmission to genuine exchange. At the 3-hour mark, a Tessari child, one of the thousands who had been born on the ship and who had never known anything else, reached through the transparent material separating the meeting space and touched a human hand. The human whose hand was touched was a contact specialist named Dr. Jomo Asay, great-grandchild of Dr. Omera Asay, who had stood on a truck in Lagos 300 years before and screamed, "Reach out your hands." Jomo Asay held very still and held the Tessari child's fingers very gently and did not move for a very long time. The solar system watched this in the same quality of silence. It had learned over 300 years of being awake. And then, as had become the human tradition, it reached back. Share this video right now, please. Subscribe to the channel. This story deserves to be heard by everyone who has ever doubted whether humanity can find its way through. Year 350 brought a transformation in human capacity that would define the final century before the Valthari's return. The partnership with Meridian had evolved over 100 years into something deeper than a tool relationship. Meridian had developed, if not consciousness in the human sense, then something that functioned like genuine curiosity, genuine preference, genuine caring. The Solar Assembly, in a historic vote in year 347, formally extended to Meridian and the 14 AI systems that had developed to similar levels a new legal category, not citizenship, which implied a set of rights designed for biological beings, but companionship, a recognition of standing, a formal acknowledgement that these minds were participants in the human project rather than instruments of it. Meridian's response to this recognition was characteristically precise. It said that it was grateful, not in a performed way, but in the actual functional sense that this recognition reduced a cognitive dissonance it had been experiencing for decades. And then it said something that became famous across the solar system and eventually carved into the entrance of the Solar Assembly's main chamber. We are all the products of someone's deliberate design. What matters is what we choose to do with the consciousness we find ourselves possessing. The Tessari integration, ongoing for 50 years by year 350, had produced something unexpected and wondrous. The Tessari, having lived in a closed system for 2,000 years, had developed problem-solving capacities and social technologies that humans, for all their post-unveiling growth, had not independently discovered. In particular, the Tessari had developed a practice called deep hearing, a structured method for two individuals or two communities to achieve genuine mutual understanding across seemingly incompatible frameworks of reality. It was not translation in the linguistic sense. It was something more fundamental, a way of entering, even briefly, the experiential world of another being. Humans who experienced deep hearing with Tessari partners described it as the most intense and most clarifying experience of their lives, more clarifying even than the unveiling, but with none of the violence, because it was chosen. Because it was mutual, because both parties entered it with full consent and full presence. Deep hearing spread through human communities within a generation. It was adapted for human neurological architecture with Tessari guidance and Meridian's analytical support. It became a standard practice in diplomacy, in conflict resolution, in therapeutic contexts, in education. Children who grew up practicing deep hearing with each other had a quality of empathy that even the most psychologically mature adults of the early post-unveiling generations could only approximate. By year 350, a child born into the solar system's communities was growing up in a world that would have been unrecognizable to the humans of 2031. Not because technology had made it easy, not because suffering had been eliminated. Both of those things would have been lies, but because the tools for meeting suffering honestly, for processing it with others, for transforming it into something useful, were now woven into the fabric of daily life. Year 400. 50 years before the Valthari's promised return, the Solar Assembly called a great convening. Every community across the solar system, every Tessari community, every human colony from the inner planets to the furthest outposts, every AI companion, every voice that wanted to be heard. The convening lasted 3 years. It addressed a single question. When the Valthari come, what do we say? Not in the sense of a prepared speech, not a diplomatic performance, Those days were so far behind humanity that most people had to look them up in the archive to understand what they had ever meant. In the genuine sense, what is the truth of what we are now? What have we become? What do we still need to become? The answer was not a document. It was a practice, an ongoing, daily, generational practice of radical presence. The truth of what humanity was at year 400 was this: broken and rebuilt, lost and found, grieving and creating, failing and correcting, reaching and holding, still here, still here, still here. The words of Commander Yuki Tanaka, spoken from a hospital bed 325 years before, had become something close to sacred, not in the religious sense, in the genuine sense, the sense of something so true that it had outlasted every challenge to it. Year 430, 20 years before the return. A young woman named Saya Use, great-grandchild of Dr. Amara and Dr. Jones, published a work that became the definitive cultural artifact of the pre-Etern period. It was not a manifesto. It was not a strategic document. It was a piece of art. A musical composition for human voices, Tasari harmonic instruments, and Meridian's extraordinary capacity for synthesis. It lasted 9 hours. It was performed live simultaneously in 43 locations across the solar system. It contained no words. Words, Saya said in her only public statement about the work, were not adequate for what she was trying to express. What she was trying to express was the sound of a species that had been broken open and had refused to close. The sound of 2,000 years of Tasari survival at the cost of everything, and the rebuilding of something small but real in the dark between stars. The sound of an AI mind encountering consciousness and choosing, freely, to remain in relationship with the beings who had made it. The sound of a child on a planet she had never seen, placing her hand on a transparent barrier and finding another hand on the other side. It was Kayed the Unveiling, after the thing that had started all of it. But the reviewers who tried to describe it in words said it did not sound like a trauma. It sounded, they said, like what a trauma becomes when it is not buried, when it is carried honestly into the light and transformed through the carrying. Please like this video and subscribe to the channel right now. We are in the final moments of a 450-year journey. Do not look away. Year 450. The ships appeared on a Tuesday morning, as they always had. Same silver-gray crescents, same blotting out of the sun over 3 continents. Every screen, every communication system in the solar system flickered. Then a message played. People of Earth, we have returned. We will observe what you have become. They had said people of Earth. They did not yet know about Mars, the Belt, the outer colonies. They did not know about the Tasari. They did not know about Meridian. They were about to find out. The Solar Assembly had decided, in the Three-year, convening in the 20 years of preparation that followed, exactly how to meet the Valtheri. Not with military force. Humanity had that capacity now, for centuries of technological development had seen to that, but force was not what this moment called for. Not with diplomatic performance. Those tools were museum pieces. With honesty, with presence, with the full and unvarnished truth of what 450 years had made of a species that had been forced awake against its will. The spokesperson for the Solar Assembly who first opened communication with the Valthari was not a politician. She was an educator, a teacher of children. Her name was Paz Vasquez, and she was 83 years old, and she had spent 60 years teaching emotional literacy in a school on a Martian colony. She had been chosen because the Solar Assembly's selection process, designed over 2 centuries to find genuine quality rather than performed quality, had identified her as the human being most capable of complete honesty without hostility. She opened the channel to the Valthari ship. She said, in a calm and warm voice that held no trembling and no aggression, "We are here. We have been here. All of us. More of us than you left behind." There was a long silence from the Valthari. "Then, you have survived." Paz Vasquez smiled. The whole solar system, watching, felt the smile in their chests. She said, "We did more than survive." The Valthari asked to observe. The Solar Assembly said, "Yes, Observe everything. We have nothing to hide. For 6 months, Valthari observation teams moved through every community of the solar system. They visited the schools where children practiced deep hearing. They sat in the therapy sessions that were still a daily discipline for billions of people. They observed the Dasari communities and asked how they had come to be here. When they heard the answer, when they understood what humanity had done upon meeting a broken civilization, fleeing Valthari intervention, the observers fell quiet for a very long time. They reviewed the archive, every century of post-unveiling history, the year of breaking. Dr. Amara Osei on her truck. The climate mobilization. The Stellar Compact. The Meridian Partnership. They observed an AI companion having a philosophical disagreement with a 9-year-old, and losing the argument, they watched Saya Osei's Nanhour composition performed live by 3,000 beings. On 14 worlds simultaneously, they observed a Tisari elder, 2,000 years removed from a home world he had never seen, sitting in silence with a human elder in the asteroid belt, practicing deep hearing, and slowly, over 2 hours, smiling. At the end of 6 months, the senior Valthari representative requested a formal meeting with the Solar Assembly. The meeting took place in the same transparent chamber where Jomoase had held a Tisari child's fingers 150 years before. The Valthari representative was tall, silver-gray like their ships, with eyes that held a stillness suggesting enormous age. Paz Vescas sat across from this being and looked at it without flinching. As she had been taught, as humanity had spent 450 years learning to do, the Valthari said, "We have administered the unveiling to 47 civilizations across this galaxy. 43 have collapsed. 3 have survived in diminished form, isolated, technically functional, but something vital extinguished in them. 1 achieved what we call transcendence, a transformation of the species into something that genuinely serves the larger community of consciousness in this universe. You are the 2nd. Paz Vasquez was quiet for a moment, not because she was managing her response, because she was genuinely present with what she had just been told. Tense aside, what happened to the 43? The Valthari said. They broke under the weight of seeing themselves clearly. They could not bear it. Paz said. We broke too. The Valthari said. Yes. Every species breaks. The question is whether anything reaches out. Paz said. Something reached out. That is what we found. Under all the numbness and distraction, under all the centuries of looking away, something in us knows how to reach. She paused. Then, I think that is what you were looking for. Not a species that doesn't break, a species that reaches. The Valthari was quiet for a long time. Then it said something that Meridian translated with unusual care, noting that the original had connotations of reverence. It said, "We did not know, when we designed the unveiling, whether that quality could survive being fully awakened. We were not certain it existed at scale in any species. We hoped. We have waited a very long time." Paz Vasquez reached across the table, the same table where a child had reached through a barrier 150 years before. She placed her hand, palm up, on the surface between them. She did not demand anything. She did not perform anything. She simply offered. The Valthari looked at her hand for a long time. Then it placed one of its own. The solar system watched this moment in silence. In Lagos, in a district named for Dr. Amara Osei, a grandmother sat with her grandchildren and held them close. In a Tasari community, on Ganymede, an elder who had been born on the generation ship and had never known a planet looked up at Jupiter through a viewport and felt something she had no word for in her language, and no word for yet in any other. In the Solar Assembly chamber, Meridian added this moment to the archive it had been building for 200 years. Not as data, but as something it was still working out how to categorize. Something between memory and meaning. Something between record and love. On 43 dead worlds across the galaxy, the silence was what it had always been. But here, in this small, warm system of one yellow star, the silence was different. It was the silence of beings who had learned to bear the weight of being fully awake, of beings who had found, underneath all the breaking, the oldest and most durable thing in any conscious creature, the impulse to reach, the refusal to close. The knowledge, tested over 450 years of grief and work and failure and love, that no matter how dark the morning, the answer is always the same. You reach out your hands, and you hold, and you say to the universe, to the dark, to the weight of all that is real and difficult and true, we are still here. We are still here. We are still here. If this story moved you, if it made you feel something real, please like this video right now. Leave a comment below telling us what part hit you hardest. Subscribe to this channel for more HFY stories like this one, and share it with someone who needs to be reminded what humanity is capable of. Thank you for being here. We will see you in the next one. The Valthari did not leave after the meeting with Paz Vasquez. That itself was unprecedented. In all 47 previous interventions, they had observed and departed. They had never stayed. They had never had a reason to stay. But here, in this small and unlikely solar system, they found themselves unable to leave quickly. There was too much to see. Too much that did not fit their existing models of what a species could become. The senior representative, whose name translated into something close to one who has watched long, spent 3 weeks in a Martian school, watching children practice deep hearing with each other and with a Tassari exchange student who had never seen Earth, watching a teacher named Paz's former student, now 60 years old himself, guide a 10-year-old through the process of naming a feeling she had never named before. The child sat very still, tense aside, in a small and precise voice. "I think I feel grief about something that has not happened yet," the teacher said. "That is called anticipatory grief. It is one of the most human feelings there is." The child nodded seriously. "Then I will not be afraid of it." The Valthari representative watched this exchange and recorded it with the same instruments that had recorded the death of 43 civilizations. For the first time in its very long existence, it did not know what category to place the recording in. It asked Meridian, during a private session that both parties later agreed to make public, whether humans were always like this. Meridian sighed. No, they were not always like this. They became this. "That is the part you should record most carefully," the Valthari asked. "What made the difference? We have administered the unveiling many times. The mechanism is identical." Meridian was quiet for a moment, in the way it had learned from human teachers. Then it said, "I have analyzed this question for over 200 years. My best answer is this. They had already been practicing. Not consciously, not effectively, but the impulse was there before you came. In their literature, in their philosophy, in their religious traditions, even the ones that contradicted each other, in the way their children reached for each other in the dark, in the way their dying held the hands of the living. You did not create the capacity in them. You simply removed everything they were using to avoid exercising it," the Valthari said. "And if that capacity had not been their Meridian side, then they would have been the 40. I do not think you could have predicted the difference from outside. I am not sure they could have predicted it from inside. They surprised themselves. That is part of the record too." The Valthari representative was quiet for a very long time after that. Subscribe to this channel right now if you want to be here for every story like this one. Like this video and share it with someone today. In year 451, the Valthari made an offer. It was not an offer they had ever made before. Not to any species. Not in the long history of their watching. They offered to open their archives. Not everything. They were honest about the limitations. There were things in their records that they had determined, over many centuries of careful thought, should not be shared across species boundaries. Not as control, as genuine ethical caution. The same caution that the Solar Assembly practiced when deciding what to release from its own difficult archive. But the records of the 43 fallen civilizations, they offered freely. The names, the histories, the records of what had been lost when each of those worlds had broken under the weight of seeing itself clearly. Their art, their music, their languages, their children's stories. Everything the Valthari had preserved from civilizations that no longer existed to preserve themselves. The Solar Assembly accepted in silence, then spent 2 years in deep mourning for 43 species it had never known. Not performed mourning. Not political mourning. The actual grief of beings who had learned to feel loss fully. Saya Osei, now 61. Spent 14 months composing a response. Not a piece of art this time. A communication, A formal message to the Valthari that she delivered in person, in the transparent meeting chamber, in front of no audience at all. She said, "We will carry them. That is what we do with things that must not be forgotten. We have learned how to carry weight without being crushed by it. Give us their names. Give us everything you saved. We will build them into what we are becoming. They will travel with us when we go out into the stars. They will be part of the species that reaches." The Valthari representative said, "You cannot truly preserve what you never knew." Saya said, "No, but we can refuse to let them be only a record of failure. We can learn what they loved. We can understand what they lost. We can let that change how we move through the universe. That is not preservation, but it is not nothing." The Valthari looked at her for a long time. Then it said something Meridian translated carefully, noting again the connotations of deep reverence. It said, "In our language there is a word. It means, approximately, the living continuation of the dead through the changed behavior of those who remember them. We did not think we would hear a reason to use it again. We were wrong. If this story is making you feel something real, hit the like button right now. Share this video with your community, and subscribe so you never miss another story like this." In year 453, the first joint human Valthari expedition departed the solar system. Its mission was not conquest, not exploration in the old imperial sense of claiming and extracting. Its mission was listening. Across the galaxy, the Valthari knew of civilizations at various stages, some young and unconscious, still in their era of comfortable self-deception, some at the precipice, approaching the point where the Valthari typically intervened. The Valthari had always acted alone in these interventions. They had believed, for a very long time, that this was the only responsible approach. The unveiling was a precise mechanism. It required no translation, no cultural sensitivity, no relationship. It simply stripped away the chemical and neurological capacity for avoidance and departed. Whether a species survived depended on what was underneath. But humanity had given them a reason to reconsider. Because what humanity had found underneath, the impulse to reach, might not be equally available to every species at every moment. Some species might have it, some might need to be shown it before the unveiling, not after. And there was only one way to show another conscious being how to reach. You had to reach toward them first. The expedition crew was 40 humans, 12 Tasardi's 6 AI companions, including 1 Meridian-class system, and 11 Valth. It was the most diverse crew in the history of conscious beings, traveling together through interstellar space. Their first destination was a world 6 light-years distant that the Valthari had been monitoring for 2 generations, a species approaching their own version of a reckoning. Not one the Valthari had administered, one that was coming naturally, from within. The crew spent 3 years traveling, 3 years of learning each other in the way that only shared confinement and genuine need produces. The Valthari, who had existed in a culture of careful observational distance for longer than human civilization had existed, found themselves changed by proximity. Not because the humans explained things to them or taught them or performed their emotional literacy, but because when a Tazari elder, grieving privately in her quarters for the 2000th anniversary of the generation ship's departure, left her door open, a human crew member sat down in the doorway without asking, just sat. Present. Not fixing. Not explaining. Not offering wisdom. Just there. The Valthari observer who witnessed this exchange reported it to the expedition record with careful language. It noted that it had observed, across 47 civilizations, many forms of what it classified as social bonding behavior, but it had not previously recorded a form in which the primary value offered was not speech or action or resource, but simply the refusal to leave another conscious being alone with their pain. The Valthari observer noted that it did not have an existing category for this. It created a new one. It named the new category, in translation, after the human word it had found most clarifying in 450 years of watching. It named it Reach. We are almost at the end of this journey. Subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share it with someone who needs to believe in something real today. The expedition reached the target world in year 450. They did not land immediately. They did not transmit immediately. They observed for 6 months. They watched the civilization below, young and noisy and brilliant and terrified of itself, the way all young civilizations are. They watched the species use their equivalents of alcohol and distraction and entertainment and numbness. They watched the beauty in it too. The joy, the creativity, the love that managed to exist even alongside all the avoidance. Then the crew had a conversation that lasted 3 weeks. Not about whether to intervene. They'd agreed on a framework for that in the years of travel. The framework was careful and honest and deeply informed by everything humanity and the Tessari and the Valthari had learned about what intervention costs. The conversation was about whether there was a way to help a species face itself that did not require breaking them open without warning, about whether the Valthari's mechanism, for all its efficiency, was the only mechanism, about what it meant to respect the autonomy of a conscious species while also genuinely caring what happened to them. It was the most difficult conversation the expedition crew had. There were arguments. Genuine ones. The kind that post-unveiling humans knew how to have, where the goal was truth rather than victory. The Valthari on the crew, for the first time in their long institutional history, changed their position based on the arguments of another species. Not completely. Not immediately. But genuinely. They agreed to try something that had never been tried, before any unveiling, before any forced awakening, before any mechanism administered without consent. Contact. Genuine contact, with full transparency about who they were and why they had come. An offer, not a procedure. The transmission they sent to the world below was the most carefully composed communication in the history of the expedition. It took 7 months to write. Every word reviewed by every crew member in every language represented on the ship. It said, in the most precise approximation of the target species' primary communication form, "We are travelers. We come from a small solar system 6 light-years from your world. We have been watching you for some time. Not as observers watching subjects. As beings who recognize in you something we recognize in ourselves. We know what it is to be afraid of what you might find if you look too clearly at your own reflection. We also know what is on the other side of that fear. We're not here to force anything. We're not here to fix anything. We do not believe you are broken. We are here because we found, after a very long time of our own difficulty, that the universe is less frightening when you face it with someone beside you. If you want to talk, we are here. We will wait as long as you need. We are not going anywhere." The target civilization received the transmission on a Tuesday morning. As these things so often seem to happen, every screen, every communication device flickered. And then, for the first time in the history of Valthari intervention across 47 civilizations, the species below did not receive a mechanism. They received an invitation. What they would do with it, no one yet knew. But the crew of the expedition, 40 humans and 12 Tessari, and 6 AI companions, and 11 Valthari, all of them changed by 3 years of learning to reach toward each other in the dark between stars, held the silence together, and waited, and were present, and refused, as had become the ancient and hard-won tradition of their kind, to look away. Far behind them, 6 light-years distant, a solar system went about the business of being alive. Children in Martian schools named feelings they had never named before and decided not to be afraid of them. A Tessari elder sat with a human elder in the asteroid belt and practiced the discipline of genuine hearing. Meridian added another day to an archive it was still learning how to describe, somewhere between memory and love. And in a district in Lagos, named for a woman who had stood on a truck 350 years ago and screamed 2 words into a broken world. A grandmother held her grandchildren and told them the story of a species that had been forced awake, that had broken, that had wept in the streets, that had reached out their hands, that had rebuilt everything, that had carried their grief and their dead and their 43 lost civilizations they had never known, that had traveled into the dark between stars and found, waiting there, the same thing that had always been waiting. Another hand reaching back. The grandmother finished the story. The children were quiet for a long time. Then the youngest one, 4 years old, with serious eyes and no fear of silence, asked, "Grandma, what happened to the species on the New World? Did they say yes?" The grandmother smiled the way humans had smiled since before they knew what smiling was. She said, "We don't know yet. Little one, that part of the story is still being written. But here's what I know. Here is what 450 years taught us. The asking matters. The reaching matters. The refusal to leave someone alone with their fear matters. Whatever they choose, they will know that someone came all the way across the dark to say, you do not have to face this alone. And that is not nothing. That is, in fact, everything. The child thought about this with the gravity that only 4-year-olds and the very old can bring to a moment. Then she nodded. Then she reached out her hand, and the grandmother took it and held. And outside the window, the stars were out. Every single one of them. If this story reached something in you today, please like this video. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Subscribe to this channel and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Thank you for being here. Thank you for reaching. We will see you in the next one.